about him and who he is. And so, wow, what a beautiful setting. So this is awesome. So I wanted to talk a little bit about who Jesus is, the resurrection, and why I believe that we can have complete confidence in that. Thank you. It's getting pretty bright. All right, so I know we're all here celebrating Christ's resurrection, but I think it's easy sometimes to forget some of the hard facts or just glaze over them just because we're comfortable with it, or that we forget that not everybody is and not everybody understands. So I wanted to give you a little background on what I'm saying when I say who is Jesus and our confidence in him. Was a study that just came out this week by Barna on 5 popular beliefs about Jesus. So the vast majority of people believe that Jesus was a real person. 92% of all adults surveyed. But younger generations are less likely to believe that Jesus was God. So you have less than 48% believe that Jesus is God. And 56% of all Christians do believe Jesus was God. But Americans are definitely divided on whether or not Jesus was sinless. And this response was based on... so basically the question reads, when he lived on earth, Jesus was human and committed sins like everyone else. And 52% agree, even though 56% claim to be that Jesus was God. So I'm kind of wondering how that happens. And that's why I wanted to bring some of the things that I really love about why we can be so confident in who Jesus was and who he claimed that he is. So of those that disagree, only 30% strongly disagree with the statement that Jesus was sinless. So I think it's important that we do take a few minutes and just talk about that. So most Americans do say they've made a commitment to Christ, over 60%, and I think that's great. But if you only have 30% that are confident that Jesus was sinless, I think that we have a gap that I want to cover real quick. So if among those who've made a personal commitment to Jesus, people are conflicted between how we get to heaven. Was it good deeds, or is it because we believe in the name of Jesus Christ that we believe that we will be saved? So only 2/3 of the group who've made a personal commitment to Christ say they'll go to heaven as a result of that decision to follow Christ. So, and there are more that just don't believe they'll go to heaven, the 2%, and 15% don't know what will happen, and others believe they've got to live a good life. So I just wanted to, this brings up just a few questions for me. If we're making commitments to Christ, but we're not trusting him for our salvation, we need to understand a little bit about who Jesus was. Did he rise? And so I wanted to cover some of those historical facts for Jesus. Historically, there's not a historian alive today that denies that Jesus lived, and that he died on a cross in a Roman crucifixion. Those are historically accepted facts. Biblical sources tell us this. Jewish sources tell us this. Independent Roman sources tell us this. Again and again, many of these men, professional historians of their time, directly after Jesus' death, recorded his death, and none recorded anything otherwise. So there's no evidence today that the existence of Jesus was ever denied by those who opposed Christianity. They opposed what he said and his followers, but never the fact that he lived and the fact that he died. So we can have also great confidence in our Bible. So the Bible was written over 1,600 years by 40 different men. During that time, between 1500 BC and 100 AD, and it doesn't contradict itself. There are over 32,000 verses with prophecies that have already been fulfilled, either in the completion of Scripture or since that time. So we can have great confidence in the biblical word that we have today. We know it to be accurate. Ancient manuscripts have been found again and again. I'm sure that many of you heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls and different new findings that keep coming up. And each of them collaborate or and point to the authenticity of our scriptures in their entirety, and that they're accurate and that we can believe them, so we can trust it. So the Bible tells us that Jesus was the physical embodiment of God entering the world. We know that Jesus personally lived, he died. We know that he specifically told us that he claimed to be God. We see that again and again. And so a lot of times, if we don't believe Jesus was sinless, or we don't believe he was God, we need to look at the scriptures. Do we trust the scriptures? Do we trust the historical evidence? The firsthand accounts of Jesus' life happened between 10 and 70 years from a historical perspective of his death and resurrection. That's when the accounts were first published, if you will. So if we have, in a historical context, nobody really argues who Alexander the Great was, what he did, or his conquests. But the first written documentation that we have about Alexander the Great comes from over 300 years after he died. The accuracy that we have on Jesus is amazing. So I think that it's important for us to know that as we run into other people, and even in our own lives, that we can have complete confidence in the historical accuracy of the Bible and in the people who wrote it. So Jesus claimed to be God. John 10:30 says, "I and the Father are one." And in John 10:13, we have accusations against him. "You, a mere man, claim to be God." He accepted worship, and we know God alone is worthy of worship. Even Jesus said that God alone is good, and yet he accepts worship. Matthew 2:11 says, "And going into the house, they saw a child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him." That was the first example I don't think he could have posed as a child baby, but he continued to. Matthew 14:33, "Those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" He never denied that. And I think that's important that we understand historically. Jesus didn't claim just to be a good man and a good preacher, or somebody that stood up for the poor or the oppressed. He did all those things, but he claimed to be God, and he clearly accepted worship. So he wasn't just somebody that off the street and preaching a good message. He really went beyond that, and we can't say that he was just a good teacher. He was, as Josh McDowell put it, he was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was our Savior. So, and we know that he was crucified and he rose from the dead. Some of the evidence for our resurrection for his resurrection, without going into too many details, is just the transformation stories you see in individuals' lives. If we look just prior to his crucifixion, you have a group of his apostles, his disciples in the garden, and the soldiers come and they're scattered. They run. Those are not people who are, they were power hungry. They saw Jesus many times. They looked at him and they thought, he's going to be our Messiah. He's going to rally the troops, so to speak, and he's going to be the next king. Several times Jesus escaped from the crowd because they wanted to make him king. So here you have his disciples, many of which even talked about, hey, can we sit on your right or on your left when you come into power? Because they knew that this guy was destined for greatness, and they wanted to be a part of that. But they weren't there to lay down their life for him. They thought they were. Peter said, "I will lay down my life for you." But what happened? We know that didn't work out quite the way he thought. So, but as far as our salvation, and going back to the statistics that I read earlier, purely because if this is a survey of American people, I know that there's people who need to reach in and really grasp that Jesus is who he claimed he said he was and what he claimed. So we know from Romans 10:9 and 10 that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. So what's next? With this knowledge of who Jesus is and who he claimed to be, what do we do? What does he ask us to do? Well, Matthew 28:19 tells us we're called to go and make disciples of all nations. He clearly called us to share the gospel. It says, "He who loves me obeys me." So are we taking it the next step? Do we have a firm grasp of who he is, who he said he is, and what are we doing with that? There's so many ways that we can be influential in the lives of others. First, for an understanding of salvation, both ours and theirs, and then for just meeting the needs of people. Romans 12 tells us that we all have different gifts, and we must use them diligently, devoted to one another in brotherly love, to share with the Lord's people who are in need and practice hospitality. We are to live in peace, avoid revenge, feed our enemies, and do not overcome evil, but do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. James tells us that religion that is faultless is to look after the widows and orphans. So we know there's a lot of things that we need to do and we could be doing. But what does that mean to me? The typical response, unfortunately today from the American church, or often myself, is we do nothing. We see injustice, hunger, poverty, and many other problems. We don't do anything. And this is not a proper response, obviously. I've studied the person of Jesus myself. I know that my future is secure. I know what he has done for me. I believe in the evidence for who Jesus is and the resurrection. And yet I meet somebody who doesn't have an understanding of Jesus and who he is. And often I'm silent. And this should not be. So for me, I want to say, enough is enough. It's time to stand up and do something. And I'm excited for ways to do that. I have 2 kids, great kids, Isabella and Joshua, and they're 3 and 5, and of course they never do anything wrong. So I have a wonderful life. But actually, no, they don't. That's not true. Isabella, my daughter, we used to have these sit-down discussions when she was just 3 or 4, and we would discuss what she had done wrong and what the problem was, and she would say, "Daddy, I'm so sorry. I will never, ever do that ever again." And you know how that is with kids. 30 minutes later, an hour later, maybe the next day if we're good, she's doing it again, that same offense. And I laugh and I look at it, how childish is this? These children, they promise to be good, but they can't, and they're so cute. And then I just hear that voice inside, "Oh, you're just the same way," And how many times have we looked at something and said, "I'm going to change, I'm going to be different, I will never do that again," and the next day, the next hour, the next year, we're right there again. So what's the hope? What's the difference? How do we take our inadequacies and our problems and our failures and turn that around for Christ's success? So we look at Peter, who I mentioned earlier. He says he's going to die for Christ. And then he denies Christ 3 times. And could you imagine if your last words to your best friend was that he heard you utter anyways, not necessarily directly to him, was, "I never knew him. I have nothing to do with him." And then he goes to his death. And you're left with that on your conscience. The guy that you said that you were going to die for is now dead, and you've denied him. So he's got that, and he knows what it's like to fail, just like we know what it's like to fail. But we fast forward to the beach. Probably, I haven't been there, but we've got a beautiful lake here. So you've got a lakeside, there's some fish frying, and Jesus has this conversation with Peter, and he says, "Do you love me?" And he says it 3 times, and he has to go there. He has to dig deep into that past and that pain in order to know, for Peter to know that that's not something that he needs to be ashamed of anymore. He's cleared that. He knows Jesus is fully aware of his past and his problems and his denial, and that we can move forward in confidence and strength. So the same is true for us. Resurrection changes everything. You have a group of ragtag people who are power hungry and looking to serve themselves, in many cases by their association with Jesus, now turn into a force that transforms our world. They go out to the ends of the earth with that knowledge, all but one dying a martyr's death because of the difference a risen Lord makes. So I love that God is also attracted to weakness. There's a sermon I heard a number of years back by David Gibbs called God is Attracted to Weakness. I encourage you to look it up if you ever want to listen to a good story. He's hilarious and brings the point home. I won't tell his story, but I will say in 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness." Has it ever occurred to you, as it eventually did to me, that your struggle may be the very thing that God uses to change your life or give you the platform to change the world? Some examples. I think I wrote his name down wrong. Jimmy, trying to remember his last name. Jimmy, he's the new director of Compassion International. And he grew up, I was at an event where I heard him one time, and he shared his story of growing up in utter poverty, and how when he went through Compassion International, he wasn't in the program as a child, but when he became president, and his mom later shared with him this story, she went to congratulate him, and she couldn't get the words out. Finally, she said, like, "Oh, I'll talk to you later." But basically, that utter poverty that he grew up in, she thought this will never give him an advantage in life. And in the end, at the end of the day, it was the very upbringing that he had that gives him the context to now run an organization that is worldwide, impacting millions and bringing kids out of poverty and giving them hope in the future in Jesus. So I just love that. You've got Paul that was persecuting the church, turns a 180, and his weakness becomes his strength. David, the youngest of 8 sons, the shepherd, that's not a good vocation. It's not well respected in the Jewish culture of that time. And he becomes the king, a man after God's own heart. So we can have so much joy in knowing that our future is secure. We know that God can even use those difficult times in our life to bring about his change in the lives of others. Another favorite story of mine is from Matthew 14, and that's the feeding of the 5,000. And I'll just paraphrase for you. I have it written down, but you have people who've come to listen to Jesus. They've been there all day, and they're just tired and exhausted. And the disciples say, "Send them away. Let them go home. Let them go to the surrounding countryside and buy themselves something to eat." And Jesus turns to them and says, "You give them something to eat." And it floors them, So what do you want us to do? There's 2 passages where they feed several thousand, and one of them they say, "Well, that's going to cost over 200 denarii. Do you want us to go out and buy all this food with 2?" And he says, "Well, what do you have?" "Well, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish and 5,000 people." That doesn't include women and children. So in John 6:9, the same version, it's the quotes, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" That's how I feel when I look at the need, when I look at my goals, when I look at my dreams. What do I have among so many? I have nothing. I've got 5 loaves and 2 fish at best. So I just want to ask you, what's your challenge today? What's God been putting on your heart? What difference can we make? There's a lot of oppression. There's a lot of people in need. And we aren't called to bring the entire solution. The inadequacy, the minimal 5 loaves and 2 fish in the hands of Jesus is enough. In the hands of our God, in the light of resurrection, that is enough. And that can make all the difference in the world to somebody else. And when we come together, we can change the world. That's all I want to do. I just want to change the world. I may only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, but I believe that it can happen. So I challenge you to do the same. I was walking with my 3-year-old son, Joshua. It's actually just yesterday. And we were crossing a log, and I'm holding his hands, and we're pretty high off the ground, and we're going across this tree that had fallen over, and we're looking around, and I've got him. But when I was at one point he got a little nervous, And I said, don't worry, I got you. And little did I know that his mom's behind me, and she's a little nervous too. So she saw me, and she was probably more nervous than Joshua. But we didn't fall. I had him. And thankfully, I still have decent balance, and we didn't fall off the tree. But God has us the same way. And just as my son, and my wife too for that matter, got very nervous about what I was doing, we get nervous, but God has us. And sometimes we just need to realize he's got us in his hands. And then the same Joshua, he also loves at night, he loves to sleep with somebody else. He loves mommy or daddy to be with him. And so he's always asking, will you sleep with me? Will you? No, Josh, you need to sleep by yourself. And so in the middle of the night, one of his favorite things to do is he'll come and he'll sneak up and, climb in between us in bed, and he'll cuddle up mostly to his mommy. But he loves that. He loves the security. He loves being close to mommy, close to daddy. And I'm always the one to carry him back to his room. But the other night he had a nightmare. He has dreams, not very often, but he's calling out, and in the dream he says, no, sissy, no. He's talking to his sister. And I go and I comfort him, and I rub his back, and I lie down with him for a little bit. And he didn't fully awake, but how much of a game changer is that for him when he realizes that he's in the presence of his parents, and he has that confidence and that comfort. And sometimes we're going through a nightmare. We're going through a difficult time, and we feel like we're all alone. We don't even know that just like that we have a God that loves us, not only when we screw up again and again, the way that we love our kids, he loves us, but he's also there. He's holding our hand. He's got our back. And that brings me a lot of comfort. So the last thing I want to go over is, I think it's time that we realize that maybe it's time for a perspective change, that we would apply the filter of the resurrection to our lives. Sometimes we can't see past the difficulty. We can't see past the storm, but God can speak Jesus spoke to the storm. He calmed the waters. He calmed the sea. And we can't see past maybe a financial difficulty, but God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. We don't need to bring everything. I think of a light switch, and you flip that switch, the light goes on, but the switch has no real power. If the switch gets stuck up and conceited, it's not to his benefit. He's not the light. He's not the power source. He's just the switch. It's a conduit. And we're just like that. We aren't the light, but we can be the light when we're connected to Jesus. And so let's allow ourselves to connect deeper and actually be the salt and be the light in our community. The call on our lives is not always easy. But that is what we're called to. And in the light of the resurrection, we can have joy in the difficult times. There was never a promise to us that, Jesus died so we could have a comfortable life and then go to heaven, but that we would have life more abundantly. We were, as James said, to consider it pure joy when we face challenges of many kinds and persecutions. So, in closing, I'm not sure how, because I've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish, but I'm planning to change the world. So we're called to disciple nations. Let's step forward in that. Let's celebrate the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. So he is risen. What are we going to do about it? So thank you very much.